Hello, I'm Gary Anderson. I'm here at Harlem Hills Prairie in Loves Park, Illinois, just north of Rockford, and it's just off of Forest Hills Road on Flora Drive. This is a state of Illinois nature preserve, and what we're preserving here are fairly rare, many of them plants and animals, which reflect what was here in northern Illinois before settlement. It's a dry site, a gravel hill prairie, and a beautiful site. I've been coming here myself for many years, more than I can count perhaps, and it's always a delight to come here. There's always something different in bloom, and it's a wonderful place to come. It is open to the public, but please respect the signage and of course don't remove anything from the property. So we're on the path here. This is a well-worn path, as you can see, and the reason we're stopping here is just to show you that it is indeed a gravel hill. We're going to proceed on up the hill here, but you can see the soil is a mixture of rocks, small pebbles. There's a lot of clay in the soil, but it is a very dry site, so we call it a gravel hill prairie. And there were a whole series of these gravel hills along this eastern bank of the Rock River, extending from pretty far north up toward the Wisconsin border all the way down to where the Kishwaukee comes into the Rock River. Actually, my house where I live is about probably 3 miles from here, and it's on a hill, and the soil is gravelly and clay just like this here. And I'm sure that 200 years ago we had a lot of prairie plants on that property. Okay, so let's go up to the top of the hill. Okay, we've climbed a little further up the hill here to show you that it is indeed a hilly site. We'll give you a little pan experience here. The spot where I'm standing right now is very high quality prairie. So this is what probably 200,000 acres of Winnebago County would have looked like before white settlement occurred. This parcel was preserved through the efforts of Natural Land Institute with 11 separate acquisitions which have been transferred to the state of Illinois. But without NLI and its founder George Fell, I doubt that this prairie would have been preserved. So we really owe a debt of gratitude to George and those early board members of NLI who cobbled this together with multiple purchases and easements and conveyances, so that now we have hopefully a permanent museum of these beautiful plants and the animals that are associated with them. I'm looking off to the south and west here. I can see many other hills beyond this. Some of course are covered with trees, but originally these would have all been gravel hill prairies just like this one. So a beautiful, beautiful spot. And you do get a sense of the openness. Prairies are about sunshine. It's a beautiful day in pretty much midsummer as far as the day length goes here, and we are washed in sunshine today. So these plants are highly adapted to their habitat. Almost all the prairie plants are long-lived perennials. They put their roots down either deep or wide or both, and they're here for the long haul. Some of these plants may be 50, maybe even 100 years old. So that explains why even though the beautiful pale purple coneflowers are in full bloom right now, I have seen many seasons where there were 2 or 3 times this many coneflowers blooming, right now in midsummer. They're here for the long haul. They're like, I don't have to bloom every year. I can bloom every third year or every fourth year. So who knows what the conditions, I certainly don't, maybe somebody does, that makes them decide to bloom this year versus last year. So here we are a little closer to these pale purple coneflowers. These are our local native coneflower, a little bit different than the coneflowers that they use in the gardens. These guys are again adapted to this dry, sunny site. They have this beautiful flower. It's a composite flower, so each of these pink or purple rays are called a ray flower, and these are called disc flowers. And this is really interesting texture. It's almost like it's made out of plastic. It always seems to me. It's like, wow, you would expect that to be soft, but it's really rather firm and a little bit spongy. The stem, as you can see, is really stout, the flower stem, and it has little hairs, and the leaves have little hairs as well. And you notice the leaves are sort of pointing upwards. They're not flopped out because they don't have a problem getting enough sun. Their biggest problem is to make sure that they're not losing too much water. It's a dry site, it drains quickly, and lots of plants here in competition. So almost all these plants have some strategy, or maybe more than one strategy, for keeping themselves hydrated, getting water. And the coneflowers have pretty deep roots, maybe not as deep as the grasses or compass plants, but still they go down a ways. And they have the thin leaves, not a lot of surface there to lose water through, and the hairs act to sort of insulate or shade the stem, etc. Now this is, I guess this is probably 2 or 3 plants, but you can see here's one, 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 here. There's a lot. Probably dozens here within just a couple square meters or square yards. And most of those are not blooming this year for whatever reason. So, you know, I don't know, I can't ask them, but you can come out here some years, maybe next year, half of these will be blooming and it'll be a tremendous display of pale purple coneflowers. They're beautiful regardless. Some of them are rather dark, like this one. Occasionally you'll see a white one out here, but they're various shades of pinkish purple and really kind of a very neat flower. The seeds are large and good for songbirds. I would think a goldfinch would love them, or other birds that are adapted to prairie. Okay, this little plant is called daisy fleabane. It is in the daisy family. It's another composite. You can see the disc, the yellow disc, and then the little white ray flowers. And of all the plants out here, I think this plant seems to be having its best year. I haven't seen this many or this prominent daisy fleabanes before. So they're having a good year for some reason. Again, just like the pale purple coneflowers, very narrow leaf, and it's held upwards, not out flat. So again, it's getting plenty of energy from just very limited leaves here in this sunny spot. Just below this little plant here with kind of the gray-green leaves is called lead plant. It's not quite in bloom yet. Maybe later in the walk we'll find one that is. This is the flower bud here, and these are the leaves. These really divided, again, small and kind of woolly leaves. So lead plant, very characteristic indicator plant of prairie. They have a little bit different strategy for water conservation. Rather than having really, really deep roots, it sends roots laterally. So the roots go probably for many yards beyond where the plant's stem is. Okay, this is probably one of the most famous of the prairie plants. I think a lot of school kids probably know this one, compass plant. Silphium lanceolatum is the technical name for this, and it's kind of a prairie classic. Now on this site, since it's so dry, they're kind of short. You may be familiar with compass plants, maybe on Searles Prairie, that are 12 feet tall. Here they're getting, well, here's last year's bloom stalks, so they got to be about 5.5 feet, which in a dry site would be tall for a compass plant. This is the earliest blooming one as we look around. So there is the bloom. It's another composite with the ray flowers and the disc flowers. And the seeds will just occur right at the junction here between the two. That's a characteristic of silphiums, of which there are 4 silphiums. Only one of them, I think, is out here. That's the compass plant. Now, why we call it compass plant? The story goes that especially when they're young, they align their leaves north and south. And you can see here that all the leaves are pretty much parallel. I would guess north is, maybe that's north. Let's see, the sun's over, yeah, so I think they're doing a pretty good job being a compass here. Why would they do that? Again, it is to conserve water. Think about when the sun is high overhead, the plants, the light's coming down pretty much vertically, and the plants have the leaves up, so like many of these plants do, the leaves are vertically oriented. So during the heat of the day, they're not losing a lot of water. But here, even in the early morning or the late afternoon, they're not exposing a lot of leaf surface to the drying sun or effects of wind, etc. The leaves are very cool. They're this highly divided leaf, and they're really rough, like sandpaper rough. Very thick. Again, that's a water conservation measure, to have a thick leaf, roughness, and just a cool plant overall. Very robust stem for the flower to be on. Very cool plant. Now they have a resinous sap. I've actually tasted this sap. It tastes like a turpentine, and it's really super sticky. It's like incredibly sticky on your teeth. People, I guess, used to chew it as chewing gum. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you can buy some good old juicy fruit or something, Beeman's or something, because this is so sticky. And if you like the taste of turpentine, then go for it. You know, get yourself some rosinweed or cup plant or compass plant juice. Now, cows apparently love this stuff, and therein lies an interesting story about this prairie. When I first started coming out here in about the mid-'80s, there were almost no compass plants out here. And now, as you look around, especially on this hill and even over on the next hill, there are quite a few. Probably, I would say in this patch, probably hundreds. So what happened? Why all of a sudden are there more compass plants? And my theory on this is that before this was a nature preserve, this was on somebody's farm, they did not plow it, so they didn't sow it to row crops, but they probably did send their cows or pigs out here for a little grazing. And cows love compass plant. They must like that turpentine flavor, good old turpentine flavor and sticky sap. And they probably grazed out the compass plants, or grazed them back so badly that it's taken 40 years now for them to come back to where they're really numerous again. So that's just my theory, thinking about this over the years and noticing that these are becoming more and more and more common. They're a very cool plant, and love them, and they're kind of, our charismatic megaflora, I guess you'd call them. sort of like the, koala bears or, famous animals that people love to preserve. Compass plants would be that for people in Illinois. Compass plant and big blue stem, probably the two really famous prairie plants that most lay people would know. Even if they might not be able to recognize them, they would recognize the name. We are sort of focused in here on a rather small patch of ground to look at some of the smaller plants that are here. And notice how dense, how many species here are in just this square foot here. Pretty amazing. We do have pale purple coneflower. We have 1, 2, 3 sort of young compass plants, maybe only a couple years old or 3 years old. One here that's probably a teenager. We have some asters, and we have this guy here which is in bud, almost ready to bloom, maybe next week or even this weekend. And this is purple prairie clover. It's another legume. Got the finely divided leaves, sort of like the compass plant, our other legume. But this guy doesn't have the sort of woolly appearance, but very finely divided leaf. A beautiful plant when it's in bloom. It's a true purple, not sort of a pinkish purple like the coneflowers. These are a gorgeous shade of purple. Here's another one with several stems. And in the background, grasses, probably mostly little blue stem. Little blue stem would be our probably our dominant grass out here, but we'll try to find some others as well. This is called bastard toadflax, and it's a very short plant that's only about 6 inches tall. Quite a few of them in here though, in our little square meter of ground. And it, so what's its secret to success? Well, rather than put a really deep root like a compass plant does, or a really spreading root like our prairie shoestring that we talked about, these guys decide, hey, I'm just going to tap into a neighbor and borrow some water from a nearby plant. So they're semi-parasitic in that they tap into a root of a neighbor, steal water, kind of like stealing cable from the neighbor. And they got their own chlorophyll, so they're making their own sugar, but they're stealing water from a neighbor. So that's another strategy if you can't, don't want to invest in working hard and putting down deep roots, you just tap into somebody who does. Wild indigo, they've already finished blooming, and looks like that one did not bloom this year, but another legume. And again, a thick leaf like we saw with the compass plant, and kind of a silvery color to the leaf. So it's another strategy to save water in this dry environment. Okay, this tiny little yellow flower is called hoary puccoon. Now there's a hoary puccoon and a hairy puccoon, and both of them have, again, the thicker leaf and a little bit silvery leaf. The hairy has longer hairs on its leaves than the hoary one does, and the hairy has more of a yellow, and this is more of a yellow-orange flower. The genus name is Lithospermum, which means stone seed, and they have super hard seeds that are about the size of a poppy seed, or maybe a little larger, but really hard, hard as rocks. So that's how I remember the genus name is Lithospermum. Just kind of a cool little plant, a very pretty yellow color. You'll notice if you come out on the prairies that the dominant colors seem to be yellows and pinks and purples. I think that's because they attract pollinators. Those colors seem to attract the bees, butterflies, moths that act as pollinators for many of these plants. Okay, here's another plant that's in bloom and pretty good this year. This is thimbleweed, and it has this white blossom, and as the plant grows, it starts with a bud like this and then opens up like here. There's a little beetle on the stem there. And then as the petals drop off, you wind up with this seed pod that looks like a thimble, hence the name thimbleweed. Kind of a cool plant, very distinctive story, and again you can tie the story with the name of the plant, which is helpful. We also have a plant not yet in bloom. This will probably be peak bloom in July, and that's flowering spurge, what my friend Ruth Little calls the baby's breath of the prairie. It's got a white flower and a big head here. You can see they're putting out the branches here, and the buds are right there. And in 3 or 4 weeks, this flowering spurge should be ready to bloom, sort of a midsummer bloom, a July bloom. And that's a good reason to come out here if you can, about once every 3 or 4 weeks, because there'll be something different in bloom. The coneflowers will be done, but the flowering spurge and maybe some goldenrods will be starting, and later on you'll get liatris, and then at the end of the year you get a lot of asters. So it's really quite a beautiful experience through the year to come out here. And another coneflower that's out here is this one. It's not yet in bloom, it's in bud, but you can kind of see the cone there and starting to get its ray flowers there. And this is the gray-headed coneflower, and some people call it the yellow coneflower. It's a little bit taller plant on average. I would say it gets about 3 feet tall maybe. We're up pretty high here, so this one might not be quite as tall as they might be in a lower area. So here it is with a thimbleweed in front. And here is our purple prairie clover. This is a grass leaf goldenrod. We've got lead plant here. So again, within just a square foot here, all these different plants. On the other side of the path here is round-headed bush clover. It's another legume, 3 leaves and furry. And it has a rather, I don't know, it's not the most wow you flower. It's kind of a not all that attractive a flower, but it is a legume putting nitrogen into the soil. So quite a few legumes that we've seen here, and even here within just this little patch we have 3 different species of legume, all of which are helping out with the nitrogen. This little guy is heart-leaved golden Alexander. The leaf has that heart shape. If you've got a really long heart, it's a little longer than it is wide, and I think human hearts are about equal, but it does kind of have that little heart shape. And it's already bloomed. These guys bloom with a yellow flower in May. So these are the seeds. And they're an umbelliferæ, which is the parsley family of flowers. I just this year bought a couple from the wild ones, and they say that they're quite aggressive in a garden situation. So I'm surrounding it with a bunch of other prairie plants. Hopefully it won't take over. The umbelliferæ do support some types of butterflies, and so they're a good part of the prairie community. And kind of a pretty plant, a little bit earlier blooming. This beautiful grass here, I'll try not to shade it, get over here, is called prairie dropseed, and it's a gorgeous plant, not aggressive, and I don't know why it's not widely used as an ornamental grass, because it really is. It's tough as nails. It survives, drought. It is a native, so it supports native insects, and it's a beautiful, they make these nice arching. And when they bloom, it'll bloom a little bit later in the season, and if you smell the seed stalks, they smell like buttered popcorn. So it's our buttered popcorn grass, a wonderful grass, prairie dropseed. Okay, we're in a little patch here of one of our native coreopsis. This is tickseed coreopsis, or coreopsis, I think it's lanceolata. They always occur in these patches, and I think, I may be wrong on this, I'm not really a naturalist, but I think this is all one plant that sends multiple stems up, and that's why you always see them in a big patch like this. We'll have a yellow flower. They're just in bud now, so I think maybe even by, today's Friday, maybe even by Monday they would be opened up. And a typical coreopsis flower, it's a yellow flower, probably an inch across. Okay, one of the biggest flowers on this prairie is this guy, which is Hills thistle. And Hills thistle is a threatened plant. It's a very rare plant. Many people have not good feelings about thistles, but this one is a native. It's not the aggressive thistles like the Russian thistle or some of those Eurasian species. This is a native one. Tends to have a single bloom, although this one has a side bud. And a huge, you can see that's, almost palm-sized single flower. Beautiful color, and there's a little insect there. I'm not sure what that is, but he's having a good time on the Hills thistle. So supporting insect life, all of our native plants, very important. Here's a butterfly going around. I think that was a monarch. But if you don't have the plants that the insects feed on, then you don't have the insects. And if you don't have the insects, you don't have the prairie birds that feed on the insects. And so it's all important to maintain what we have, especially for our rare species. So Hills thistle, and it's really doing well. I think that it's a biennial, so it only lasts 2 years, which is very different than most of these plants. Most of these plants are long life perennials, but this one seems to be thriving. Here's a little patch with, what did we count, a dozen plants, I think. So that's really good to see. And as thistles go, quite a beauty. The native ones tend to have the grayish underleaf, which is one way you can tell. And you can see that's not your standard Russian type thistle that blooms later in the year and is a problem for pastures, etc. Just coming into bloom and into view is this little brown-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta, H-I-R-T. It's got a very hairy, actually kind of soft and fuzzy leaf, like a lamb's ear almost. So it's, again, shading itself with the hairs. And not a ton of those in the area here, but there's a good example, just coming into bloom. These are last year's pale purple coneflower blooms. They've been stripped of the seeds. So you can see last year was a little bit better year. We have a lot of stems in this area where nothing's blooming this year. Okay, so maybe this patch decided to bloom last year and these guys down here are blooming this year. So kind of an off year as far as number of blooms, but they still are going to provide plenty of seeds for birds to eat this fall and winter. And again, little blue stem. We've got lead plant here. We've got flowering spurge, pale purple coneflower. Got that. I'm not sure what that is yet. So quite a diversity of species. This is still a very nice, high quality prairie area here. No compass plants in this area though, for some reason. They just haven't gotten over here yet. Okay, we're just below the crest of the second hill, kind of over from where we started. And just a nice stand kind of pale purple coneflowers, a lot of compass plants, some good grasses. I can see flowering spurge and pale purple prairie clover. I'm sure there are many asters in here as well that will become more obvious later. So really nice hill prairie example. You can see butterflies flying across, looking at the pale purple coneflowers. Here's a dragonfly, or a damselfly, I guess it is. So this prairie community is pretty unique. It doesn't look like your roadside weed patch or your sort of fallow ground that the farmer has decided not to plant this year. It's got a whole entirely different set of plants, which are beautiful and hardy and native. And you may be wondering, why is this patch of ground that nobody's mowing, why is it not full of dandelions or some of the weeds that I'm battling in my yard? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is just competition. A dandelion would not really stand much of a chance of getting enough water, competing with all these long-lived perennials that have deep roots and other strategies for getting water. Dandelions are great in lawns where they get watered and they don't have a lot of competition. But coming out here, they're not going to have too much of a chance of success. Another reason is prairies get burned periodically. Now, of course, before settlement, the fires were either set by Native Americans or by lightning. And there are millions of lightning strikes of the earth every day, actually. It's incredible how many times lightning strikes the earth. So you think, wow, that can't happen very often, but it would happen all the time. And if it would hit before the prairie started in the spring or in the fall, when the plants are starting to dry up and suck their juices back down into their roots, there's a good chance that a lightning strike would start a fire. And a fire, there was no fire department, so the fire would burn until it burned out, either ran into a river or a stream or ran into a woodland that was more resistant to fire. So these prairies would get burned in big patches. There's evidence that Native Americans would burn them to flush out game for hunting in the fall. And these plants are very fire adapted. They're not bothered by fire, even pretty hot fires that are very intense. I did have the experience of participating in some controlled prairie burns back in the 80s and 90s, and I can tell you, especially if there's Indian grass, these fires are hot, man. Indian grass burns like whoosh, like there's gasoline in it almost. So these plants, they burn very well and they're adapted to burn, and they'll green up within about a week or 10 days of a prairie burn. They'll already be green patches as the grasses start to come back and some of the herbaceous perennials start to sprout. So I'm not sure if this patch was burned or not this spring. There are some stems that you think would have burned if they had burned this patch, but that's the primary management tool. If you're trying to establish a prairie, if you've got 40 acres you're not using, you can also mow for the first few years, and that helps knock back the weeds. But eventually, if you keep up with your burns, the prairie plants will start to dominate and provide a little habitat for our native prairie species. One of our favorite spring flowers, of course, is shooting star. And there are many shooting stars out here on Harlem Hills Prairie. This is a nice example of a rather robust shooting star. It's already got its seed pods. So it bloomed in May. They have a pink to purple bloom and sometimes white. And they're a great garden plant, a beautiful garden plant. Now sometimes if they're in a very dry site, they'll go dormant in the summer, but the energy is stored in a little bulb under the ground. So they'll come back year after year. Really wonderful plant, and that's the shooting star. Very cool. Come out here sometime in May and you won't regret seeing thousands of shooting stars in bloom. One of our little sunflowers, the oxeye, and really in full bloom. There's just one with a couple side buds here, but a really nice, beautiful yellow, butter yellow. Well, I don't know, that's darker than a butter yellow. It's more of an orange yellow. And again, the ray flowers and the disc flowers. Okay, this little guy is a milkweed, and I think it's the small green milkweed. It has typically just one flower at the top that's green. So it's not the common sort of ditch, Asclepias syriaca, the common milkweed, but it's more of a dry adapted milkweed and not spreading in clumps like that one does. We also found a golden Alexander here that's just finishing up its bloom, just to show you that it is indeed a golden color. So that's that heartleaf golden Alexander. Really past its prime, but still having a little bit of color there. Well, thanks for joining me on this virtual tour of Harlem Hills Prairie. It's a gorgeous spot. It's really good basically May through October. So if you want to venture out, if you're tired of sheltering in place, come on out here, have yourself a walk, listen to some birds, and experience some beautiful flowers. Thank you.